Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Good evening. Welcome to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsay Davis Stover, and I'm excited to have joining me with this evening, Sean Perrryman, who is the president of the Fairfax County NAACP. Sean, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Oh, and thank you, Lindsay, for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Now, Sean, we met, 3 or 4 years ago now. In fact, when we met, you were actually an attorney on the House Committee for Oversight and Government Reform, working for Congressman Elijah Cummings. Tell us a little bit about that experience, because having worked for such a national treasure, what was that like?
It was quite the experience, and one of the probably best experiences of my career, at least. Congressman Cummings was an inspirational figure all the time. It wasn't something that was just when the cameras were on. So it was a little overwhelming at times to be with someone who was both so inspirational but also so genuine. He really firmly believed the things that he said. And I'll never forget the interview I did with him the first time we met. I had prepared all this stuff on policy and different things. And we sat down, and the first question he says is, what feeds your soul? And that was pretty much the start of our relationship. And it was amazing to work with him and see the things he did and said and how he lived out his values in Congress.
I love that question. What feeds your soul? That's such an incredible way to start a relationship, but to start every conversation. That's really amazing. Now, as your work as president of the NAACP, can you talk a little bit about the organization and your goals and priorities as we move forward?
Right. Well, I'm the president of the Fairfax County chapter. We've been here in Fairfax County for over 100 years. We got our start in Falls Church, and it was actually related to Black people in Falls Church being pushed off their own land. And that was what started the NAACP. The organization, the national organization, was hesitant to even let the chapter form in what was in a pretty rural community because they thought it was so dangerous to have an NAACP chapter. So as a president and the youngest president in our 103-year history, I cherish that history and am humbled to be a part of it. So being the president is almost like a full-time commitment, especially these days. But it is a volunteer role. So, we are all volunteers. We're just very passionate about what we do. And we have a long history of people who are volunteering, but serving their community. I always encourage people to join the NAACP. It gives you a voice. It gives you a stake in your community, and it helps you make it better.
Well, let's talk a little bit about membership. At the event last week, you had talked a little bit about how membership was going up. Can you talk a little bit about membership and the rise you've seen here in just the last few weeks?
Yeah, we, like I said, from time to time, we obviously have several different paid members and people who come to us in different ways. It's can range anywhere from 500, 600 people. Within the last week or two, especially after the events with George Floyd, we saw a huge spike in membership. And after our car rally, which we held in memorial of George Floyd, we had close to, I would say, 275 members last week join. And that number's still going up. We actually don't know the number yet because it's every minute it seems to be rolling in with a new application. So we've been overwhelmed with it, but we are adapting. We're going to actually have a welcome session on Zoom this Thursday for our new members. We're going to have to do about 2 or 3 of those to break it up to service all the new members. But we have people who are anxious to make change in their community, and we're going to try to find a way to get them to work.
That's incredible. Just to hear those numbers are going up the way that they are. Can you talk a little bit more about the event last week that I know we've referenced, but attended with my family the car rally last week, and it was just one of the most moving and incredible experiences. And we were kidding a little bit before the show started, but your speech was so inspirational and moving. And I told you, even my 10-year-old daughter was so moved by your words. And I know people have reached out to you to let you know that as well. Can you talk a little bit about the rally and how meaningful it was, and what the action steps are as we move forward?
Yeah. So to give you some context of the rally, obviously after the murder of George Floyd, we were all upset. We saw some of the protests going on in Washington D.C. and varying levels of violence and things, some police brutality there. But the other thing that was top of mind too is COVID-19 is still very much a real thing and out there. So we wanted to give people a way to protest, to express themselves, that they may feel safe in doing. And we saw that there was a need for that there. So I said, why don't we have a car rally? Why don't we get as many people as we can in a car? That way they can socially distance. I said, well, maybe we were just kind of thinking this up on the fly, and it really got our creative juices going, because we said, why don't we do this on Facebook Live so you can stay in your car if you want, or if you feel comfortable, you get out and wear your mask and that sort of thing. Well, we put out the notice that we were doing the car rally on a Monday, and we did it on a Wednesday, the actual rally. Within those 2 days, we attracted went over 1,000 cars. I think 2,500 people, maybe more. And this was just showing that the community wanted something like this. They wanted a way they can be out there, but not be fearful of the virus, but also come together as a community and show that this matters. This is an important thing.
Well, one thing I loved about the rally was you saw people from all generations, right? And you saw families and children with signs, and it was just such an incredible environment. Can you talk about how meaningful that is to see so many different people come out from different backgrounds, different religions, just come together in that moment to ensure that we all can do something to move forward?
I mean, it was beautiful. It's beautiful to see the community come together, especially during this time where we have to be apart, right? So this was sometimes, for some people, the first time they were actually seeing people in person in 2 months. We're going on month 3 now of this quarantine.
Right.
So I think it was very meaningful for them, but I think it was powerful too, because sometimes, and I've experienced this in my role in the NAACP, we meet with legislators and policymakers, and they will say, this is a Black issue, this is a niche issue, no one cares about this. And that's not true. And you see that when you see these sorts of events where people come out in masses and let their voices be heard. This isn't a niche issue. This isn't a issue that's only for the Black community. This is an issue of human rights. This is an issue for every single member of our community. It's an issue of determining how we're going to live as a society. Are we going to allow these things to happen? So I think all of that, just being there, being present, all of that was communicated.
It really was. And, so many people came out, as we've been discussing. How do you take that energy now and continue it? Because it is, you mentioned COVID-19, there is a lot of challenges right now. And how do we harness that energy that we all felt at that rally and continue that momentum so that we can create more change?
Well, that was my challenge to the crowd when I was at the rally. I said, if all you do is show up for a car rally, then we would have failed. This is something that is generational. Institutional racism is a generational struggle. And it's been for several generations now. And we can't just show up one time and think we've solved it. So what I encourage people to do is, join an advocacy organization like the NAACP. It doesn't have to be the NAACP. I'd love to have you, but join something. Join someone who's already in this fight so that you can lend their voices to theirs, and you can know some of the strategies and tactics they've already been using. I think what we are planning to do next, obviously I'm having our welcome event for all our new members, but next Tuesday, I'll be inviting the Chief of Police, the Board of Supervisors, and local legislators to a virtual town hall where we will present them with our policy recommendations. And we want these new members to call their local officials, write their local officials, tell them that we want you to adopt the NAACP's recommendations, because that is the only serious thing that can come from this. I know a lot of policymakers, a lot of elected officials will say Black Lives Matter. I tell people, say, that's nice. What are you going to do to show that they matter? What is the policy solution you're pushing for? So we're trying to educate people. We're trying to make sure that they don't fall for empty symbolism, that they're looking for substantive change.
That's absolutely important, is making sure that we push for substantive change. And you talked a little bit about the recommendations that you want to put forward to our elected leaders and to our county officials. Talk about what those are and how the community can get behind those recommendations and further support. Yes, we can call our legislators, but what else can we do to ensure that our elected leaders and our police departments understand that this is a priority for our community?
Yeah, so some of the changes that we're calling for are strengthening the civilian review panel that we have here in Fairfax County. And frankly, we're going to encourage state officials to adopt them in other counties. So in here, Fairfax County, we need to have a civilian review panel that has subpoena power, that can investigate, that can make recommendations on punishment, because these things are important for accountability. What we see in Minneapolis and in several other jurisdictions is a lack of trust. Because if you trusted that the system would bring you justice, you wouldn't be in the streets. So if they can get ahead of that now and do these things to build trust, then we can avoid situations like we're seeing all throughout the country, frankly. Other things that we're telling about is demilitarizing the police, making sure that Fairfax County doesn't allow the use of tear gas on its own citizens, that they don't buy a bunch of military equipment from the federal government, because this isn't Baghdad, this is Fairfax County. So we want some of those changes. We want to have community input, an annual review of the use of force policy, so that we can make sure that we are keeping up with the times. Fairfax already has a pretty good use of force policy. It doesn't allow for chokeholds and stuff, but we need to make sure that these things are in place. And Lindsay, as we're speaking, even now, we have people marching in the streets. We have all these conversations going on. And just this weekend, a Fairfax County officer was arrested for stun gunning a man 3 times who was having some sort of health episode. He was in distress, obviously, and they assaulted him. One officer, it only took was one officer. Everyone else was trying to calm him down. This officer comes on the scene and immediately attacks this man. So this is not something that's happening elsewhere. This is happening here. So we need to make sure that we have the proper checks in place, but we also need to make sure that the community is involved in this. So we have other changes as well, but that's to give you a taste of some of what we're recommending.
And Sean, that's such an important point to make, because yes, everyone, or I hope most people, have understood the impact of the murder of George Floyd. But you're absolutely right. It's not something that's just happening in other places, or it's not something that's happened, years ago or even a month ago. It is happening right now in Fairfax County. And I think that's what people really need to fully grasp, is that these things are happening while we are marching in the streets, and while attention is put on police brutality and the way police are treating people. And so I think that's such an important point that shouldn't be lost in this moment, is that we are requesting and demanding change because we need it now.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I always have to mention that the Fairfax County Police Department is separate from the Sheriff's Office. I think the police department has tried to taking some steps to improve themselves. Obviously, they're not perfect and they could be better, and that's what we've been pushing for. But the Sheriff's Office is a mess. And I want to be very clear in that at the start of the whole COVID situation, I wasn't responding to COVID at that time because the Fairfax County NAACP and the Loudoun County NAACP was seeking the freedom of an inmate who had been sexually assaulted by a deputy, Deputy McPartland. So this happened at the beginning of the COVID crisis. This man was arrested. He has 2 prior killings that he did while working for Fairfax County Sheriff's Office. And there was almost no media attention to it because of the COVID crisis, but also because when the victim is not dead, you know, we say these Black Lives Matter, but it seems to only be when there's a killing. That can't be. We can't have people who get beat up and stun gunned and survive, and then, you know, we go our separate ways. We don't care about that. They get sexually assaulted and we don't care about that. So I tell these stories because I want people to know this is going on in the county, and there's a serious problem with one of our elected officials, that being the sheriff, and we need to do something about it.
You made the point of making sure to make the distinction of the police department and the sheriff's department. Are there ways in which best practices can be transferred from one to the other, or can be learned from one to another as we move forward? Are there ways in which they can work together to be better at these issues?
I think there are ways that they could improve. I really think it falls to the Board of Supervisors. And I've had this conversation. It's been a point of frustration for me. They say the sheriff is elected and that's not in our purview and they have plenty to do. We actually had a general branch meeting, and Jeff McKay told me, you know, well, I have other things to deal with in this county. But they are the ones who write the budget for that office. They have the power of the purse. And I think if we wanted to make change in that office, we should, you know, make them hurt for things like this. There should be no reason that Natasha McKenna gets killed by the same deputy then who later goes on to sexually assault another inmate. So we need to have some sort of accountability. We need to stop pointing fingers to everyone else. We need our leaders to step up and say, this is how things go in Fairfax County, and there's certain things that are unacceptable. And I may not be able to force you to change a policy, but you know what? I'm not going to keep funding it. So I think that's one of the changes we need to see.
Now, that's an interesting point. I mean, do you find when you're talking to elected leaders, and while not all of them, I'm sure, would do this, but do you find many of them try to point fingers or wring their hands at the issues so they don't have to be the ones to get down and really figure out how we fix this systemic problem?
Absolutely. I think, have you ever seen the meme with Spider-Man sort of pointing at himself, the different Spider-Mans? That's sort of what the elected officials look like when there's something that they don't want to solve. This falls under this person's purview. This person can do this. I can only do so much. We need people to say the buck stops here, that there's a culture that we're going to do. And I understand sometimes there are problems that are outside of their control, but they can still speak up on it. They can still say that, you know, I'm a leader in this community. I don't think this is the right thing to do, and I'm taking a stand on it. And we are constantly pushing people to do that.
Well, you made a great point too. The power of the purse, in a sense, is a huge power to have. And when our Board of Supervisors set the agenda for spending and the priorities and how much they allocate money for you know, each different department and issue, I mean, that in a sense shows the importance and priority they place on things by how much they're willing to fund them, right? I know you and I have talked many times before about affordable housing and how that's been a huge issue in Fairfax County. And while we do hear many elected officials talk about it being a priority, when we look at the budget every year that's proposed, it's not necessarily reflected as a priority. Can you talk a little bit about that and the importance of funding initiatives like this to ensure that we can better serve the citizens of Fairfax County?
Yes, absolutely. You know, a part of how affordable housing is funded is through the penny fund. They take a penny taxes and that goes to affordable housing. We've been encouraging people to expand that fund because it's not enough, frankly. We trail behind Arlington County when it comes to affordable housing. Some of the other things that we would love to see funded is early expansion of early pre-K education. So these are all the things, these are some of the items that we want to see funded. And I can't help but when we're having this conversation, the current cry that we hear a lot of times on Twitter and in the streets is defund the police. I think people misunderstand what that means. It doesn't mean you don't have a police department. That's not what they're saying. It's not like let's go to lawlessness or the Old West. It's that we make certain judgment calls and priorities. And a lot of times what we end up saying is we defund education. At the General Assembly this session, they took all the money that they had that was supposed to go to counselors in schools, and they took it out of there. The Board of Supervisors, they were supposed to roll out more body cameras. They said we can't afford that. So you're making policy choices about what you want to fund. If you're funding the police to get more shiny new weapons, but not cameras, you're saying I'd rather them be armed than be accountable. If you're saying I rather fund counselors in schools, or sorry, cops in schools than counselors, you're saying I believe that these students need to be treated like criminals and not like kids. So these are all choices. So when people say defund the police, it doesn't mean lawlessness. It means make this a priority, that if you are going to fund things, fund counselors, fund things that we know improve our community. Do not fund police departments to drive around in Humvees armed to the teeth, because we are not enemy combatants. We're your citizens. So I think we really need to think about how we're doing policing. We need to reevaluate how our entire system is working in the light of this moment.
I'm glad you brought this point up, because I think there has been a lot of confusion around, the talk of defund the police. I was listening to a conversation on the news this afternoon about it, in fact. And I think too, talking about how we reprioritize where we put our money is really what we're saying here, right? And putting it towards things like education and affordable housing and, maybe continued workforce development initiatives, right? Are all things that lift up our community. And I think, you said it so eloquently before, making sure that where we put money is where we're also prioritizing to ensure that we can lift our community up.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And maybe the defund the police should be called divest from the police, right? That's what we're saying. We're saying move that investment somewhere else. But I think what we need is we need to reprioritize how we treat people. When there was an opioid crisis, we made a decision that was a public health crisis. And I think that had a lot to do with the demographics of who was suffering from that opioid crisis. To give you an example of it happening locally here in Fairfax, some of the changes that can be made. One of the things we're calling for with the police is to get rid of the SRO program in the schools. I know that's going to be controversial because people think, what's going to happen to my kid? Well, there's data out there that shows having an officer in the school makes it no more safer. And not having an SRO program doesn't mean you don't have access to the police. They could be across the street or whatever. They're not operating in the schools. Because the only thing we know, and this is a 2008 GAO study from the federal government, is that when you introduce police inside schools, the only thing we know for sure is that boys, especially Black boys in Spanish, and Latino and special ed students are going to be arrested more. That is the formation of the school to prison pipeline when we introduce police in schools. The NAACP, Fairfax County, we fought hard for a change with the memorandum of understanding of how the police operate in our school system. It gave them less discretion to act. And within 1 year, we saw a 60% drop in arrests. We didn't see any comparable rise in crimes or anything else. It's because a lot of times students are being arrested for things that are behavioral issues. So we have to educate people that when we talk about removing police from certain institutions, not because we hate the police, it's not because we don't want you to have access to police or want you to be unsafe. We just know that when police are introduced into certain environments, it's what I said. You have men with hammers, they look at everything as nails. So we need to change that dynamic.
That's such an important point to make. And, one thing I want to do before we wrap up this segment is I want to do a recap of the events that you have coming up in the NAACP, because I know that many of our viewers, and I have heard from many friends and neighbors of how can we join this organization. Can you talk a little bit more about the events you have coming up? And then I'd like to direct people to your website so they can find out more information about the organization. Because as we talk more in our second segment too, you all have so many different priorities and things you're working on throughout our community. And there's so many ways to get plugged in to the organization. So can you recap those events for us and tell us a little bit about where people can go to find out more information?
Right. So they can go to fairfaxndaacp.org. They can follow us on Twitter at Fairfax NAACP, also the same on Facebook. They can follow me on Twitter at Sean Perryman3, or they can follow me on Facebook. I'm happy to be friends with anyone because I like to get the message out. And as far as events, we are going to have a town hall, a virtual town hall with elected officials and law enforcement on Tuesday, June 16th at 7 p.m. We'll be sending out more information about that. That's our most recent event. And then we're also having, if you join as a member, we're going to have several virtual socials so you can know how you can get involved. And people are eager to get out there. Not everyone can go out to a rally all the time, but they can get involved in different ways, and we'd love to have them.
Now, during the town hall meeting next week, will there be a forum for participants to ask questions of elected leaders and participate via Zoom in that way?
Yes, so it depends also on the interest we had. We had a town hall with a superintendent. Over 1,000 people joined. We could only fit 300 on our Zoom. So what we do is redirect people on Facebook Live, and we can't get to all the questions there. But what we typically do is we'll allow you to ask questions in the chat function in Zoom, and we will read a lot of those questions and then filter them to the guests.
That's fantastic. So if you're not able to join the Zoom meeting, you will be able to follow the town hall meeting via Facebook Live then.
On Facebook Live, that's right, and that's unlimited, so as many people who want to come can.
Oh, good. And if people are inquiring about membership, are they able to sign up for membership on your website?
Absolutely. When they go there, they can see how to join as a member, even just to join our newsletter, just to stay informed. But membership's only $30 a year for adults and $10 for kids. And so we welcome people if they want to be involved with our cause.
That's fantastic. And even if you just want to learn more about the incredible work the NAACP is doing here in Fairfax County and have your voice heard and participate in those ways, sign up for the email alerts, sign up for the updates, sign up to receive more information about the events, because this is such a critical time in our country and in our communities. So we hope that you will go to their website and learn more about the organization. We have to go to a quick break, but we will be right back. So please stay with us. More to come with Sean Perryman.
Today I'm going to talk to you about physics. Come on in, girls. Let's go. This is the first rocket to get humans to Mars.
Really tall.
I'm a rocket structural engineer, designing and building parts of the rocket. You are the generation that will be stepping foot on Mars. Do I have a group of astronauts on my hands?
Yes.
You can become a rocket scientist or whatever else you want to be.
I got a crick in my neck, limp in my step, cramping in my muscles every time I try to flex. But if you throw me love, I'll throw you some more.
Opiates has taken everything and everyone I've ever loved away from me. Everything. I blew my ankle out and I got prescribed pain pills by my doctor. If making my detox public is gonna help somebody, I'm all for it. I just wish I would have had a warning.
Opioid dependence can happen after just 5 days. Know the truth, spread the truth.
Give your town a reason to celebrate, because every Goodwill item you bring home brings job training and more to your community. Goodwill, bring good home.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rigged out life. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to the Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Lindsay Davis Stover, and we're continuing our conversation this evening with Sean Perrryman, who is the president of the Fairfax County NAACP chapter. Sean, thank you again for being with us this evening.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And we ended the last segment talking a lot about the incredible work the NAACP is doing right now. Can you expand a little bit more on the efforts and initiatives that the organization is taking this year to ensure that we can better our community?
Right. So one of the things we are really focused on is education. Prior to being the president, I was the education chair for Fairfax NAACP for about 2 years. And so that's one of my passions. We are looking at how do we get more equitable hiring in FCPS. One of the things that came out a few years ago is that they have a pool of talent, specifically Black talent, that they're just not hiring. And if they do hire them, they put them in certain schools. We have 26 schools within FCPS with no Black teachers in it, which is unacceptable in this diverse county. 26, yes. And so this is front of mind. Up until about a year or two ago, they didn't even have a hiring policy, which is why principals were kind of left to their own devices, and we saw the results of that. So this is something that we're going to be focusing on. We are also focused, and we announced this at the beginning of the year, that Robert E. Lee has to be no more as of this year. And I'm excited to see that it looks like they just put out the schedule that they are looking to rename by July. So the next school semester, when they open back up, there will be no Robert E. Lee, which is long overdue.
That's really interesting. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's long overdue. Why has it taken so long to rename that school?
You're gonna get me in trouble. I think it's taken so long because people drug their feet, frankly. I mean, I think also Tammy Koufax is the school board representative for Lee, and I think she was nervous about renaming it because, you know, there is a very small, very vocal community that they want to keep these Confederate names. But we're seeing across the nation, in Alabama, in neighboring jurisdictions, everyone is getting rid of these symbols of racism. And that's all they can be called. The Confederacy was very clearly formed. You know, the Vice President of the Confederacy said it very famously in his cornerstone speech, that the Confederacy was based on the sole idea that the Negro is inferior to the white man. That was it. So you cannot say, as an elected official or as someone working in this county, Black Lives Matter, while you stand on Robert E. Lee Highway in front of Robert E. Lee's high school. You can't simultaneously say this while glorifying white supremacy. So this is a simple change, one I won't applaud them for because it should have happened, but it's a necessary one.
Absolutely. And as you said before, a long overdue change to what needs to happen. We talked a little bit last segment about the march that the NAACP hosted last week. And we are seeing marches across the country. I mean, just in every city. And as you know, I grew up in small town Texas, and I was so thrilled to see a huge march take place on the streets of the town I grew up in. And I never thought something like that would happen. And I think this is such an incredible moment right now where it feels like we have the opportunity to continue to fight to create change. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means across the country right now, how everyone has come together and demanded that their voice be heard?
It feels different to me. It feels like a different time. It feels like people are finally engaged and willing to really push to change things. And it's been a groundswell of outcry that things need to change. And not to get too abstract, but the thing that's really interesting to me with watching these is when you look at the civil rights era of the 1960s that we all know about, the cries there were the famous signs is "I am a man" or "Equal justice now." It was sort of declarative, like we're people. Now it's very much white silence is violence, and white people need to change and inform other white people. So it's naming that this is a cultural thing that needs to change, and that's really what racism, the form it takes now. It's not codified racism where I can't sit at the bus counter or, I can't go certain places. It's far more insidious in ways, in the sense of, I am stopped by the police. I may have a very negative interaction, possibly a dangerous one. And I have to then persuade white people that I am telling the truth. I may not be hired. I don't know why. It's all very covert. So I think people are seeing this now. They're seeing that video that this was done so callously by an officer killing this man, stepping his knee on his neck, and for that long a time, that we have to see that this couldn't have been the first time he did something like that. And we see from his record that obviously it wasn't. But I think people are seeing that there are forms of racism all throughout our society, and they're ready to root them out in a lot of ways, and people are ready to have those conversations and educate themselves. And I just hope that energy continues.
One of the most incredible images I saw was civil rights icon Congressman John Lewis standing on the street that the mayor of DC renamed to Black Lives Matter Street. And it was just one of the most incredible pictures, right? Here is a man who has sacrificed so much and in so many ways has taught our nation about hope and equality, and has done it in such a powerful way. And it was almost like the era of the civil rights movement of the 60s was joining in a way with what we're going through right now. And it was just such a powerful image. And I think it resembles the many generations we see right now taking to the streets and demanding change. And it was just such an incredible image. And it does feel like something is different right now. And the conversations that I think people are having around their dinner table are different. I think the conversations people are having with their neighbors are different. The relationships that are coming from this as well, I think can only help us as we continue to move forward. And you mentioned a little bit about white silence. And we've heard a lot about privilege too. I want to really break that down with you, because I think that's so important, because this has to be something that we all want to make sure that we demand the change that is needed. Can you talk a little bit more about that piece of it?
Right. Yeah, I think so. When we talk about privilege and we talk even saying the word white, it's very loaded. People have an instant reaction, and it takes a lot to get people past that. And I try to educate them. I'm like, look, I don't have anything against you because you're white, but you are white. This is a social construct, and the society accepts you as white. And I have to do some educating on that. But when we talk about privilege, it doesn't mean you're rich. It doesn't mean that you are cheating the system somehow. It means it could be as simple as this. When I sit down with an elected official, they may not hear me as well as they hear a white woman sitting across from them, because they have that bias that they think that, they're there to serve you. And they look at me as, well, this is just a sort of side constituency of mine. So it's getting people to understand that the way you're seen and operate and walk through the world is very different. Is very different than how I may be seen and how I operate and walk through the world, and you may be treated differently. And to use that privilege to do something, because if you are silent, then you are complicit in a lot of ways. If I presented with you that there are people being brutalized in the street, people being treated unfairly, and you know this and you do nothing, then you, I think, in some way are tacitly accepting that this is the system that I'm in, and I don't have a problem with it.
Right, and it's these conversations right here that we need to have. We need to have them in our churches. We need to have them in our places of worship. We need to have them at our dinner tables. We need to have them in our PTA meetings, right? In every area in which we come together, these conversations need to be had. And I feel like sometimes these conversations are ones that people avoid. But maybe this moment right now, maybe that is the forcing function for us to have these types of conversations, because I think you're right. It's about education. It's about creating those relationships and creating deeper understanding that really will help us come together.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think some people aren't equipped to have the conversation. So what I always tell people is, educate yourself on your own and then have that conversation, right? If you hear me talk about whiteness or white people or whatever, you may be thinking, well, he has something against someone with blonde hair and blue eyes, whatever. But the whiteness, our definition of whiteness in America has changed over the course of the century, right? So if Italians weren't white, Jewish people weren't white, Irish people weren't white, they became accepted as white at some point, just in American society. So it's not a biological thing. It is a distinction that we are making, and we have made by law, that you are white and you were entitled to certain privileges because of that. You were allowed to accumulate certain wealth and go to certain colleges and everything. I'm the first person in my family to go to college because my mother grew up in South Carolina, where that was like saying you wanted to go to the moon. So there can be a person of my same age whose parents had those opportunities. And that leads to the wealth gap and everything else that we talk about. So it's educating people on, I'm not indicting you by saying this, it's just a fact, and it does have relation to how we're treated in the world, how we talk about society and where we are as people in this community.
And you touched on it a little bit before, but it's about the education, but it's also about the understanding of how to use that privilege. Can you talk a little bit more about that piece of it? Because I'm sure you've been asked by many people, what can we do? How can we help? I saw this tweet string that was almost comical, right? About, white people asking, what do we do? How do we do it? How can we help? Answer that type of question for us, because I think, we talked a little bit about it last week at the rally. I know a speaker touched on it as well. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is part of this hard conversation that we all need to be having.
So the good news is there are multiple ways that white people can help. And it really depends on how they want to do it. The bad news is that, I think it requires some discomfort. So some of the easy ways that white people can help is finding advocacy organizations, donating to them. They could also join them, because it's way more powerful when I come in a room with two middle-aged white ladies and Black people. I come in with a coalition of people, because then I'm not just asking this for something crazy that only I want. This is something the community wants. You are seen as part of this community. But it's also having those difficult conversations and with your relatives, with your friends. It's checking people when you see things that are wrong. And some people say, I really feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And I think people have to really understand the difference between feeling unsafe and feeling uncomfortable. They have to understand the difference between just feeling something inconvenient to them. Because those things, that having a conversation at your family, your dinner table with your friends, it may make you uncomfortable. But if we allow those seeds of racist thought to perpetuate, they're going to make other people unsafe in our community. They're going to lead to things like that. And I always say, it's interesting, before the whole George Floyd thing, a couple days before, I think, we had Amy Cooper in Central Park, where she was calling the police on that black man. And that video is so disturbing to me, but also so interesting, because she calls the police and she makes this description. There's an African-American man attacking me, and she's making her voice sound. She understands the power she holds in that situation. Well-meaning white people a lot of times act like, well, what do I do? You have a lot of power. You know it. On some level, you know it. And you need to use that for good. You need to call those congressmen and those and put on the Amy Cooper voice there, right? So you need to step in and use it in that way. So it's getting the people to understand what their power is and what their privilege is, and use it in an effective way.
That's so important. And you touched a little bit on elected officials, and we've talked about keeping elected officials accountable. Arguably this November could be the most important election of our entire lifetime. And I know we hear that every 2 years or every 4 years. In Virginia, we hear it every year.
Every year, yeah.
Right? But talk a little bit about the importance of this election in November, because it is so important, especially in these current conditions with COVID, that people still find a way to vote. Can you talk about the importance of it?
Yeah, I think this is the most consequential election of our lifetimes, in a sense. We are at a turning point where Americans cannot leave their houses in some places. They cannot, there are riots in the street. We're seeing police buildings being set on fire. We are at one of the weirdest times in our country's history, one of the most dangerous in some ways, one of the strangest. We're also dealing with financial crisis in a lot of ways. 40 million people are unemployed. If we do not reverse course, I don't know if there will be a course to do anything on going forward, honestly. So I think for people, and I'll be completely candid, I'm not crazy about Joe Biden as a candidate, honestly. But that said, we can't keep going this way. So it doesn't matter of whether I'm crazy about the person or not. We need to change course. We need to change in leadership.
Absolutely. And we often, every 4 years, focus on the White House, right? And many voters, in fact, sometimes only vote every 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
We talked a lot about tonight the importance of the decisions that local leaders are making in our community and the direct impact that they have, whether it's, overseeing the purse strings, where our money is spent, to ensuring that policy changes are really put in place. Oftentimes those elections get glossed over in many ways. Can you talk about the importance too of, yes, the White House is so important this November, but so are the local offices. And can you talk a little bit to that importance?
Yeah, absolutely. So the things like responding to a pandemic are very important at the federal level. So we need leadership there. But most of the things that we are combating are happening here locally. If you want to take down racist symbols, that's your school board, that's your board of supervisors. I can't help but think about this past weekend where we saw a police officer assault a man with a stun gun. I don't know if we would have seen him prosecuted under the former Commonwealth attorney. We had to get a Commonwealth attorney who was willing to hold police accountable. And our last Commonwealth attorney punted on that several times. So we have seen positive changes. During the COVID crisis, our Commonwealth attorney released people from jails. He's been responsive to us. We've seen those sort of changes. So the local elections matter. And our advocacy matters, but we have to have the people who are willing to listen be in power.
Absolutely. That's such an important point, because that is a great example, the Commonwealth's attorney, that people had direct impact. I mean, he was just elected, last November. Mm-hmm. And already, right, you can see the effects of that particular election during this COVID-19 crisis.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We're already seeing the difference that makes. And I think, we elected pretty much a brand new school board, and we're seeing some of the impact of that. I'm not sure if we get to Robert E. Lee being changed under the old school board. Actually, I know we don't, because we didn't. I think we see what a local elections have. And then, I mean, even up until the governor, some of the decisions and some of the actions he's taking and not taking are an effect of who he is and who we elect. So I think people need to be involved in the primary process and in all parts, whatever party they're a part of, because this is really what's going to affect your local community, the things that happen around you.
Right. And so much of the power that we all have, right, is in our vote. And not to take that seriously and be educated when you're going to the polls is something that we can't afford to do right now. It is too important of a time, one, not to be educated about who we're voting for, but two, not to vote. So
Right.
making sure that you find a way to vote this November is so critically important to our democratic process and to a lot of the change that we've talked about tonight.
Yeah. I mean, we just finished talking about John Lewis, and this is a man who suffered all sorts of violence just to have his right to vote. I mean, that's what he was doing there on the Pettus Bridge. So we can't take this for granted. We have to remember the sacrifices that were made so that everyone could vote. And even with the COVID crisis, we have to fight for absentee ballots. We have to make sure that people are out there and exercising their right to vote.
And as we kind of wrap up tonight, talk a little bit about what justice really looks like. We will continue to march in the streets. We will continue to demand the changes that we need. But talk about, as we kind of recap on the importance of this November, ultimately, what does justice really look like?
That's a great question. I think justice comes in a lot of forms. A lot of times when people think about justice, they think about the criminal justice system. And that's one form where we want equitable, not equal, but equitable criminal justice system where people are ensured a fair trial, where they're not harassed by the police, where the discretion that's in the system isn't used disproportionately against anybody based on their race, gender, or anything else. But I think justice, true justice, is it's bigger than criminal justice. It's about education. It's about early, being able to send your kid to early childhood education and knowing that they're going to have the same start as someone else who may have more money than them. Justice is about having a society that supports us, whether you're sick or disabled or anything, that you know that you live in a community that will support you and not harm you in a way, right? So it's about building a community that serves all of us to the best of our abilities and best of the system's abilities. And so that's what, going back to our conversation about budget priorities, right? That's a form of justice, right? If we are building in a system where we're saying government is here to serve the people, it is here to protect them, to make them better citizens, then we have an equitable education system. We have a system where the people trust the police, and we have a system that ultimately isn't taking advantage of anyone or making some people victors and some losers. So I think that's, when we think about justice, we have to think about it in a holistic way, that we are truly serving each other and our community.
And I love how you take and outline that holistic approach. And as we've talked about tonight, trust in the police. Is there a path for us to be able to do that as we move forward?
I think there could be a path for us to do that. I think there has to be trust, transparency, and accountability. That's the hallmarks of trust in any kind of government system or government entity is transparency and accountability. I need to be able to see what you're doing, explain why it's not arbitrary, why it's fair, and I need to be able to know that I can hold you accountable for when you do something that's against your policies, against our laws, or that's wrong. it's simple, but it's just a hallmark of trust, public trust. So I think our police system needs to have more data out there. We need to have a database for when an officer commits a violation. He can't just go to the next town over and get hired again. We need to have some sort of accountability to ensure if an officer commits a crime, he will be charged, he will be prosecuted, he will be off the force, he will not be paid and be on sick leave and paid while he's gone. We need to have those things in place to make sure that there's trust in the police department.
Absolutely. And I can't thank you enough for your leadership right now. It is so needed, and you have inspired so many people. And thank you for everything you're doing. And I don't want our show to end without you once again talking about where people can go to find more information out about the NAACP and how they can get involved.
Right. Yeah, if you go to fairfaxndaacp.org, you can join as a member there. We have committees. We break everything out by issue: environmental committee, education, political action. You can be involved at whatever level you feel comfortable at. You can follow us at Fairfax NAACP on Twitter and on Facebook as well. And we put out a lot of information there. You can also follow me, Sean Perrryman, Sean Perrryman 3 on Twitter. And I'd be happy to tell you about how you can get involved. The thing I would say is that I joined the NAACP after the 2016 election, and I stuck around, and now I'm president. So I think anyone can come and volunteer, and if you are willing to serve, you can have your voice heard.
Well, and I saw too that it is one of the top branches in the country, that it has been recognized as one of the top NAACP branches in the entire country.
That's right. We did win a Thalheimer Award, which is something they give to an outstanding branch. We are definitely going to try to get it again. So we do consider ourselves one of the best branches in the country.
Well, thank you again, Sean, for being with us tonight. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the conversations that I know you are initiating all across our county, and for your advocacy and your work on such important issues that will ultimately lift our entire community up as we move forward.
And thank you, Lindsay, for inviting me, and all that you do and the support that you give us. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you. And thank you all for joining us this evening for this important conversation. Sean, I sure hope you'll come back and we can do a part 2 to this Inside Scoop, because these are the discussions that we need to be having right now as a community, and we need to be finding ways to continue to push for the change that lifts us all up.
Anytime.
Thank you again for being with us. We hope you will join us next week. Good night.